Have you ever come across a problem at work and thought, we need a system to do that? Well, that's what this course is all about. It's about how you get from that idea in your head to an actual system that helps you accomplish some business process or task. This is the Analysis for Business Systems course. My name is Ken. Welcome. In this course, we're going to take on the role of a business analyst. A business analyst works as a liaison among stakeholders in order to elicit, analyze, communicate, and validate requirements for changes to business processes, policies, and information systems. This is kind of a lengthy description from the Institute for Business Analysis, and it describes effectively what a business analyst does and what we're going to learn to do in this course. It's a technical description that basically means a business analyst helps translate requirements from the business owner or process owner to the systems developers or the IT staff who might be buying or building a system to meet those needs. The BA kind of works as a translator, so to speak, between the needs of the business and the capabilities of the organization's IT staff. This course is going to emphasize the science and the art of converting ambiguous and contradictory business concepts into business process models. The models must be correct, but also precise enough to be implemented. When I work with undergraduate students, they often don't like to deal with ambiguity. They like to know that there's a right answer out there. That's not always the case, however, as I'm sure most of you know. And so part of being a business analyst is learning to embrace this ambiguity and learning to kind of carve some definition out of the ambiguity. And that's what we're going to learn to do in this course. We're going to study critical BA skills such as evaluating your current processes, recommending strategic solutions, and working with the stakeholders to clarify and document requirements. We'll spend a lot of time discussing requirements in particular. Then in the third module, we'll look at developing process models and data models. These are effectively diagrams that help describe both our current systems and the systems that we wish to implement. And then finally, a large element of all of this is the human side of change. We'll take a look at the concept of organizational readiness and what things you can be doing throughout the implementation of a new system to ensure that it's successful. We're going to use the systems development lifecycle as our primary model to move through the course. We'll begin in plan phase. This is where we take an inefficient process and we make a plan for how to address the inefficiency. During the plan phase, we might create certain documents, such as calculating the potential financial benefits or value of undertaking a project. We might create a straw man project plan or define our particular approach. Sometimes we don't spend enough time identifying exactly what the problem is. And so again, in plan phase, we'll talk about tools and techniques for identifying the problem. However, we'll spend most of this course in the analyze phase of the systems development lifecycle. Again, we're going to take on the role of a business analyst. So we're going to have our BA or business analyst cap on. And as you might imagine, based on the title, most of the BA's work comes in the analyze phase. It's during this phase where the BA works with business stakeholders to define requirements for a new system, as well as draw process models and data models that might help people build or buy a system that meets those requirements. We'll spend most of our time in this phase. Towards the end of the course, the BA's job, however, is not done in the design and implement phase. So towards the end of this course, we'll take a look at the BA's roles in the design phase, as well as the business analyst roles in the implementation and maintenance phases of a project. This course is based on a course we teach here at the University of Minnesota to our undergraduates. That course is based on a textbook, Systems Analysis and Design, by Alan Dennis and company. The book is not required for the Coursera version of this course. However, many of the diagrams that you see and figures and examples come from this textbook. It's not required, but you might find it helpful to have a copy of this textbook. Finally, business analysis is a skill. Just like sports or playing a musical instrument, skills only get better if we take the time to practice them. There's only so much we can learn by watching a YouTube video about how to play the violin. Business analysis is much the same. Throughout the course, you'll have opportunities to essentially draft or practice some of these skills by producing a deliverable. I encourage you to take the time to actually do this. If you're just watching the videos, you're likely not acquiring the skills that you need to be effective in this discipline. So be sure you take the time to work the problems that we give you. If you don't do this, then you're not truly absorbing the material that we're trying to convey to you. I mentioned my name is Ken, and I'm excited to be teaching this course. My undergraduate and graduate degrees are actually in computer science, so I have more of a technical background. I began my work in industry in 1996 with a company named Cargill, which is one of the largest privately owned companies in the world, headquartered here near Minneapolis, Minnesota. I also spent time in my career at Microsoft and spent most of my career at a little company called 3M. At 3M, most recently I was responsible for managing a couple of research and development labs where we worked on developing new interactive systems that eventually would make their way into products. What's also interesting is I started teaching at the University of Minnesota about the same time I started my industry career. And that was back in 1996, and I think I've taught just about every semester since then here at the University of Minnesota while working in industry. I'm very excited to teach this course, and I hope that you'll stay with us through an exciting trip through the systems development lifecycle. Several years ago, I had to make a last-minute trip to Europe. When I opened my passport, I realized that my passport expired in less than 90 days, and that wasn't good enough to get me into Europe. I had to renew my passport, and I had to do it within just a few days. Thankfully, I logged into the U.S. Passport Administration's website, and I found that we had a passport office here in Minneapolis, where I live. I was able to make an appointment via an automated phone system, go down to the passport office the next day, and I had my passport in hand by the end of the next day. This was an example of a highly automated business process. In this course, we'll be focusing on business processes, analyzing them, and eventually automating them. After this video, you'll be able to provide an example of a business process, just like I did a few minutes ago. You'll also be able to identify something called a context diagram. We'll introduce those in these first few lessons, but we'll come back to them in more detail later in the course. Finally, you'll be able to describe the various types of diagrams we use to document business processes. Many of these diagram types we will explore in great depth as part of this course. Let's start by looking at the example I used to open this video. As a U.S. passport holder, I needed to renew my passport. As part of this process, I exchange information, essentially, with U.S. passport agencies that they need to process my application. You can see on this diagram here, which is called a context diagram, that I would give the passport office information such as my name, some photos. I might give them my expired passport. I might also give them some money. All of these are inputs effectively into the process, and the output of the process is a renewed passport for me. This is the U.S. passport renewal process represented as a context diagram. And part of what we'll be learning to do in this course is to take a business process, which we may know informally, and document it using a formal system such as a context diagram, a data flow diagram, or an entity relationship diagram, just to name a few. What you see on the screen is an example of something called a swim lane diagram. It's a close cousin of the flowchart. We use flowcharts or swim lane diagrams to document processes. We can use them to document how a process currently works. We can also use them to document how we wish a process would work, sometimes called the to-be version of the process. In this diagram, you can see typical flowchart terminology, such as boxes that represent processing steps and diamonds that represent decisions. You can also see various swim lanes. These reflect the areas of responsibility for those dimensions of the process. We'll look at how to create a swim lane diagram in a future video. Another type of document that we might use to document a process is an informal architecture diagram. The diagram you see on the screen here is an example of an informal architecture diagram. There's no specific syntax here like there might be for a context diagram or for a flowchart. Its purpose is simply to provide some context or increase the overall clarity or understanding of a particular business process. We can also use much more formal diagrams like this. This is something called a data flow diagram, and you'll learn in depth how to create these as a part of this course. Data flow diagrams follow a very specific syntax, very much like flowcharts or swim lane diagrams. And this specific syntax helps contribute to greater understanding of where data might be flowing in a process. The context diagram that I showed at the beginning of this video is one form of a data flow diagram. And there's a very specific set of rules to creating and balancing these diagrams that you will learn as a part of this course. Another type of diagram is very informal, might be something like this. This is a diagram of a crime scene, and this shows you that there's no specific syntax here, but something like this contributes to the overall understanding of a business process and its context. And we won't be studying these in great depth, but just to note that there are, in addition to the formal diagrams that we study, there are any number of informal diagrams that help contribute to the understanding of business processes. As we move ahead in the course, you're going to learn the specifics of what a business process is, as well as how we plan and analyze those business processes so that we can target them for improvement and further automation. The other day I was trying to order concert tickets online. It was a website that I don't use very often, and it had an old email address stored as my login. I couldn't figure out how to change my email address and get my tickets delivered to me, so I just didn't order the concert tickets and I didn't go. This is an example of a business process that was poorly automated, and that will be the focus of this course. After this video, you'll be able to define what a business process is, describe the components of a business process, and we'll also talk about the varying levels of automation with respect to business processes. As you can see from my example, a lack of automation can sometimes lead to a loss of business. Consider, for example, a simple software chore, which is a purchasing system that automates the ordering, billing, and shipping of parts so the salesperson can input a customer's order and have it automatically processed and delivered. Every business, nearly every business, has this type of scenario. We might model that scenario in something called a context diagram, and that looks like this. The context diagram shows the system, and in boxes around the system we have what are called external entities. There are several components or dimensions to a business process, and those are labeled in this diagram. You can see the process has inputs. In this case, the salesperson is entering the order, and the contracts department might be inputting the contract terms, such as net 30 or net 60. Also, the process does some processing, and that's represented by the central box here, the purchasing system. We will explore context diagrams in much more detail in future lessons. Processes also have outputs. So in this case, you can see the invoice and the shipping paperwork eventually go to the customer. And then we also have some sort of boundary around the process. There are certain activities that go on that aren't necessarily part of the process that we might look to automate. It's also important when we're first defining the process to note any assumptions that we might have. So for example, here the pricing file is within the boundary of our system, but the contracts file is not. And we also have an assumption in this case that customers don't place their own orders. This is important to the overall definition of the system. You might think of other things that you might want to model when describing your system. For example, the customer might tell the salesperson what to order, so there's a communications channel there. However, that might be outside the boundary of our system because we've made an assumption that says that all orders in this case are placed by a salesperson, even if the customer is communicating with them by phone or email, for example. We might also have physical goods that move around. So in this case, maybe the parts that are being ordered. Do we have to show those in our diagram? Generally, we do not, because these diagrams represent data flows relative to the process and not necessarily the physical goods that are moving around. Context diagrams have a very specific syntax and meaning, and again we'll explore that in further depth and detail in a future lesson. This is another example of a context diagram from a textbook that's showing a context diagram for a digital music download system that might be similar to what we know as iTunes today. You can see, just like our previous example, we have the process in the middle, external entities around the sides, and then data flows represented by arrows in the diagram. We'll explore these in much more detail later in the course. Business processes can be automated to varying degrees. Everything from completely manual processes like we might have had in the early 20th century, all the way up through a process and all of its exception cases being fully automated. In this course, we focus most closely on those processes that could benefit from an increasing degree of automation. In other words, just because it's a manual process doesn't mean that that's necessarily a bad thing that needs to be improved. There are many manual processes that work just fine. On the other hand, if it's a manual process that's causing a lot of pain, it might be a candidate for automation and analysis like we will cover in this course. In future lessons, we'll dig into how we analyze the process by first describing the as-is process and then modeling the to-be process with increased automation. You'll use the tools and techniques that you learn in this course in order to improve processes and add that increasing degree of automation.